2018, I have to give you an introduction about the economic performance in the first half of this year before I take questions. In the first half of this year, against profound changes of the international situation, people of all walks of social life implemented the Xi Jinping thoughts for socialism of Chinese characters in a new era. We have implemented the spirit of the third plenary session of the 19th CPC National Congress. We have benchmarked with high-quality development requirements. We have focused on our work and managed to have a stable and relatively fast economic growth. We have switched gears between new development momentum and traditional development momentums according to our statistics. In the first half of this year, the GDP of China increased by 41 trillion RMB, increased by, if we look by quarter, the first quarter increased by 6.8% and the second quarter increased by 6.7%. If we look by industries, the first industry increased by 2.2 trillion yuan. The second industry reached 16 trillion RMB, increased by 6.1%, and the tertiary industry increased by 7.6%. The agriculture industry continued to improve its structure. It is expected that we will have good harvest at the end of this year. For cotton and soybean, we have increased their cultivation area, and the poultry production reached 35 million tons, increased by 9%, and pork production hit 24 million tons, increased by 4%. And hog production increased by 1.2%. Industrial growth maintained a stable momentum with improved structure. In the first half of this year, the industrial added value above certain SCIO increased by 1.6%, and SOE economy increased by 7.6%, and foreign invested enterprises increased by 6.2%. If we look by sectors, the mining industry increased by 1.6%, the manufacturing industry increased by 6.9%, and electricity and gas and water supply increased by 4.5%. High-tech enterprises and manufacturing of equipment increased by 15.6% and 5.2% respectively. In June, the industrial added value above certain SCIO increased by 6%, and total profits of enterprises hit 2 trillion RMB, increased by 25%. Third, the tertiary industry grew significantly, and new service industries boomed in the first half of this year. And in the first half of this year, the added value above certain SCIO increased by 8%, maintaining relatively fast growth, in which the high-tech service, financial lease service maintained robust growth. In June, the service industry index grew by 8%. From January to May, the operational profits of enterprises above certain SCIO increased by 5.3%, 1.2% up against the same period last year. The high-tech industry and new service industries grew significantly by 18.1% and 5.2% respectively. And four, the social retail consumption increased steadily. In the first half of this year, the average consumption per capita reached more than 9,000 yuan, increased by more than 2% against the same period last year. The average consumption in urban areas increased by 6.8% in nominal terms, and the average consumption for rural areas increased relatively by 6%. According to a region, the total retail sales increased by 15.2%, and the total retail sales in urban areas increased by 10.5%. By consumption categories, the restaurants industry increased by 9.9%. The retail of commodities increased by 9.3%, and total retail sales of consumer goods increased significantly. Home appliances, cosmetics, and telecommunication facilities increased by 10.6%, 10.6%, and 10.2% respectively. In June, total retail sales of consumer goods increased by 9% year-on-year. Fixed assets investments continued to increase, and private investments started to recover. And in the first half of this year, fixed investment increased by 6%, and the increased speed lowered by 0.5% against the first quarter. If we look by industry, the first industry investment increased by 13.5%, and the second industry increased by 3.8%, in which the manufacturing industry increased by 3.8%. And this is 3% higher than the first quarter and 3% higher than the same period last year. The third industry increased by 5.3%, and the infrastructure industry increased by 8.3%. In the first half of this year, the real estate industry had a total investment of 5 trillion RMB, increased by 9.7%, and the total sold areas of real estate increased by 3.3%. Total sales volume of real estate hit 6 trillion RMB, increased by 13.2% year-on-year. 7. Total sales of total disposable income increased by 13.2% and grew by 8.2% in nominal terms. If we look by region, in urban areas, the total disposable income reached more than 13,000, increased by 5.8%, and the average disposable income in rural areas increased by 8.8%. And the actual growth after deducting price elements increased actually by 8.8%. The median figure of disposable income reached 12,000, increased by 8.8%. According to a survey in 31 provinces, the unemployment rates hit 5.7%. In the first quarter of this year, the total number of migrant workers increased by 8%, and the average income of migrant workers reached 3,661, increased by 7.5%. 9. we have shown new momentums for development patterns and restructuring. And in the first half of this year, the tertiary industry grew more significantly than the second industry, and it increased by 0.3%. Than the second industry. By demand structure, the eventual demand contributed to 39% of our GDP growth, and we have also robust growth of new products and new commodities. And from the first half of this year, the total retail sales of industry increased by 6.3% against the same period last year, and industrial robots increased by 23.9%, and new consumption also grew significantly. From a trade structure perspective, in the first half of this year, total retail sales online increased by 30.1% year-on-year. The real commodities online grew by 29.8%, accounting for 17.4% in the total retail sales. Non-real commodities had a total transaction 39% larger than the same period last year. The average energy consumption reduced by 3.2% in the first half of this year. This is mainly due to the deepening of restructuring and supply-side reform. In the first half of this year, the utilization rate of energy increased by 0.3% against the same period last year. And as of June, the outstanding areas for SCIO in the real estate industry lowered by 14.7%. From January to May, the average operating income for industries and enterprises against a certain scale reduced to 84.9 yuan in every 100 yuan. This is 3% lower than the same period last year. We have also a very optimistic market expectation, and in June, the PPI reached 44.4%, and the non-manufacturing PPI is also kept within a controllable and reasonable range. In general, the national economy in the first half of this year have maintained very robust growth. We have more positive elements than negative ones, and which has laid a solid foundation for achieving the yearly targets. But we must also be mindful that we are in a very tumultuous time, and we still face a lot of uncertainties and challenges. We have to concentrate our energy on developing our own economy by expanding effective domestic consumption, and by actively addressing external challenges. We have to guide proper social expectations of the economy. We have to further engage in adjusting our structure and change and improve the performance of our economy. All right. Thank you very much to Mr. Mao, and now the floor is open for questions. I'm with China Central Television. My question is, in the first half of this year, despite of the changing external environment, how could China maintain such robust economic growth? Thank you very much for your question. From what I have introduced just now, in the first half of this year, we have maintained relatively stable and fast economic growth. I think you can understand it from the following 4 areas. Number 1, we have maintained stable economic growth. By growth speed, in the first half of this year, GDP grew by 6.8%. In the first quarter, it's increased by 6.8%. In the second quarter, it's increased by 6.7%. For 12 consecutive quarters, it has been kept within a moderate growth of 6.7 to 6.9%. By employment, the surveyed unemployment rates for 3 consecutive months has been lower than 5%. In June, it was 6.8%. In large cities, it was 6.7%. And this is the lowest level since we established such a survey mechanism in 2016. If we look by CPI, in the first half of this year, it's only increased by 2%. This is a mild growth, and this indicates that there is a general balance between supply and demand in a society. And PPI increased by 3.9%, and the increased SCIO actually lowered by 2.9% against the same period last year. This 3.9% increase of PPI is very reasonable. It's conducive to lowering the cost of downstream industries. And second, we have upgraded our economic structure. If we look by industry, the third industry grew very fast, and its increased value accounted for a larger margin in China's overall GDP. The service industry is contributing significantly to our economic growth. And in the first half of this year, it's contributed to 60.5% of our national economy. And this indicates how much our economy is hinged upon the tertiary industry, and the agriculture industry is also having a better structure. Looking in general, the consumption contributed 70.5% to China's overall economic growth, and private investments and also investments in the manufacturing industry also improved dramatically, and investment in exports and import increased by 2.3% year on year. And third, we have switched our development momentums. Since the beginning of this year, we have further delegated power and enhanced all service to enterprises, and total number of market entities on a daily basis is 18,000, meaning each and every day we have 18,000 new market entities. If you look at the industrial sector, you will find out that the increased values of volume against a certain SKU grew significantly by 9.2% and 8.7%, and this is a very significant achievement. If you look by new consumption and new demand, the consumption in the service industry is growing very robustly, and we feel that tourism, education, and old age care, these industries grow very strongly, and but we also see very robust growth in home appliances and also in industrial robots. And fourth, we have to look at this issue from the improvement of efficiency and quality. For the first half of this year, we have implemented the strategy of quality-oriented, and the energy consumption in per 10,000 RMB of GDP reduced by 6.2% year on year by efficiency. The average income increased by 6.2% against the same period last year, and if you look by per capita income, it's even had a growth larger than the GDP growth. If you look at the operating income and profits of the service industry increased by 15.9%, and also the revenue of the government also grows significantly. So in general, you can see that our economy maintained very robust growth in the first half of this year. And this achievement is a very difficult one given the uncertainties of the external environment and also given the deep-seated restructuring of our national economy. All right, next question. I'm from Reuters. In the first half of this year, the trade conflicts between China and the United States have dealt a heavy blow to China's economy, and a lot of people are expecting an impact to China's economy in the second half of this year. What is your take on this? Thanks for your question. From what I have introduced just now, all the major indicators of our economy are very stable. As for the impact of trade frictions between China and the United States, if there is one, it will be very limited. As for what kind of impact it will have on China's economy in the second half of this year, we will have to wait and see. But frankly speaking, it will definitely have an impact. But we live in a world that is globalized, that is intertwined with each other, and our industrial chains are also connected with one another. The trade war launched by the United States will affect the steady growth of world trade. As for the impact on price, to our judgment and measurement, the price has maintained relatively stable momentum, and the imported soybean may register some fluctuated price changes, but imported soybean only accounts for a limited margin in CPI. And it will maybe increase the price of pork and egg and maybe food oil. But from the first half of this year, the average level of pork, average price level of pork and food oil are at a very low level. So even though there is a price hike to those products, it will have a limited impact to our CPI. And also, the consumer price index is expected to have a mild growth in the second half of this year. This is mainly due to China's moderately stable fiscal policy. And also, if you look at the three major factors of CPI, if you look at the food sector, in recent years, China's grain output is very satisfactory, which laid a solid foundation for the stable price growth of China's food. And if you look by service in the first half of this year, due to the improvements and progress in medical service, and it's expected that the service price will maintain stable in the second half of this year. So we can expect a very ideal situation in the second half of this year. And also, in the industrial sector, we do not have a very high price pressure, and also China is expanding its opening up and reform, and we will dramatically increase our demand. So if you take all these elements into consideration, you will know that in the second half of this year, the average price of commodities will maintain mild growth. And with Economic Daily, from the recent indicators consumption is sluggish and exports are going down. And does this mean that the economic pressure in the second half of this year will increase? Thank you for your question. There are actually two questions. The first question is, how do we look at the consumption at present, and how do we look at the economic trend in the second half of this year? I will have to disagree with you that the consumption is sluggish at present. From all the indicators, the consumption in general has maintained a very robust growth. The overall consumption is very ideal. You can look at this issue from the following angles. Number one, by price. From first half of this year, the consumer price increased by 2%. This is the mild growth. This indicates a general balance between demand and consumption. And you know that in recent years, the supply is very sufficient and the price is growing mildly. And this indicates that there is a continuous expansion of demand. And also, number two, by imports. In the first half of this year, imported commodities increased by 11.5%. From January to May, the imported services increased by 15.4%. In addition to some bulk commodities which registered a very significant growth, we also have some very robust growth in other areas, for example, commodities, for example, cosmetics and maritime products. And this indicates that we do have very strong consumption broadly. And also, maybe your concern comes from the total retail sales of consumer goods, which registered not quite an ideal figure in May. And in the first half of this year, the total retail sales of consumer goods increased by 9.4%. So from the first quarter, it's increased by 9%, and second quarter, it's increased by 10%. So this is a very robust growth. And you have to understand that due to the adjustment of auto products tariffs in May, the consumption of automobile in May dropped in May. This has lowered the overall total retail sales. But if we take out these elements, take out the purchase total consumption of vehicles in May, then we're going to have a very robust total retail sales of consumer goods, both in the second quarter and in the first quarter. And if we take out this factor, we're going to have a much more stronger total retail sales of consumer goods in the second quarter than in the first quarter. And also, if you look by service industry, from recent years, you know that China's economy is featuring a upgradation of consumption. This is demonstrated in robust increase in consumption of services. In recent years, consumption in services increased by an average of 1% annually. And bear in mind that total consumption of service accounts for 50% of total social consumptions. And this indicates that the average growth pace of consumption of services is larger than consumption of goods. So, to answer your first part of the question, we actually have a very strong social consumption. And as for the second part of your question, we have to look at this issue from three areas. From the indicators in the first half of this year, we do have a very strong domestic consumption, and social consumption is playing a significant supporting role. And as I have just elaborated, we have all the conditions to maintain relatively fast and stable consumption growth, because consumption is a rigid demand. it's a rigid driving force. And the average income increase is also aligning with the increase of consumptions, and also the overall pace of upgrading China's consumption is overwhelming and overarching, and it will only be strengthened instead of weakened. And number 3, China will continue to meet the demand of the public in leading a better life, and this means that we will have to increase the supply and consumption. So from all these indicators, we can expect a very robust growth of consumption in the second half of this year. If you look at investments in the first half of this year, let's look at this issue from 3 categories. In the manufacturing industry, investment increased very dramatically, and this momentum is expected to continue in the second half of the year. And if you look at the investment of the real estate industry, it increased by 10% in the first half of this year. Actually, specifically speaking, it's 9.7%. And for the second half, we have to look at 2 major indicators. The first is new construction areas, and also the new land transactions, and both indicators grow very significantly. And also we need to look at the investment in infrastructure. Despite a sluggish growth in the first half of this year, but in the second half of this year, we expect more infrastructure programs to be implemented and executed in the second half of this year. So we are going to expect a very robust growth in infrastructure investments. So this is all about domestic consumption, but external consumption, external demand is also very important, and our foreign trade maintained relatively a good shape in the first half of this year. We do face a lot of challenges, but there are also a lot of positive elements. So in general, we can expect a very good growth momentum in the second half of this year. Thank you. Next question. I'm with Japan News Agency. As you have mentioned that the total retail sales of consumer goods dropped in June, and can you further elaborate on this? From the first half of this year, the investment in infrastructure really has lowered its growth, but we have to look at this issue from an innovative point of view, because if we look back and see the past decade, total investment in infrastructure has maintained a very high and robust growth. For the past decade, if you just walk around in China's different places, you will find a lot of new buildings. And so this is actually the reality. And if you look at the social effect and the public-private partnership, you can expect much more investments in infrastructure in the second half of this year. So we expect that the fixed investments and investment in real estate will maintain a stable momentum. Thank you. Thank you. I'm from China News Agency. I have a question regarding the profits of enterprises against above certain values, above certain skills, because there are many different understandings and perceptions about this issue. May I ask for a further elaboration? Thank you for your question. There are some discussions on the society about the profits of enterprises above certain skill. We are attaching great importance to this issue, and we also elaborated on this issue from some websites, from the official website of National Bureau of Statistics. What I want to say is that, number one, the figure is reliable, and it also goes in line with other relevant figures. The CPC central government, Central Committee and the central government attach great importance to the quality and reliability of economic figures. And we have worked out a punishment guideline for officials committing fraud in economic figures. And we are holding those accountable if they commit fraud in figures and economic indicators. So, in general, the quality and accuracy of figures have increased dramatically. And the figure for profits of enterprises above certain SCIO is in line with other figures in the first half of this year. We know that a major part of the profits, a major element affecting the profits of enterprises is the cost or price. If you look at the electricity usage of enterprises between January and May, it's increased by 8.7%. And retail and total cargo by train increased also by 14%. And also you can look at other relevant figures from January to May. Tax revenue increased by 19%, and revenue from industrial sector increased by 16.6%. And also the profits of SOEs increased by 20.6%. And also the profits of listed companies from January to May also increased by 15%. So the figure of profits of enterprises above certain SCIO is in line with all those figures that I have just elaborated. And also the measurement methodology for this indicator is very scientific, and we have used this figure for nearly 20 years. And when we say above certain SCIO, this certain SCIO is referring to the SCIO of 20 million yuan. And so the market actually changes. A lot of the enterprises, they may change their categories, and they may have a lower operating volume, and some of them may even go bankrupt. And some of them, despite how small they are, they can be elevated to the category of enterprises above certain SCIO. And we have very strict procedures to categorize different enterprises. And over the past year, because we have strengthened the procedure for approval, the total number of enterprises above certain SCIO actually dropped. So how do we measure the profit? We are using the format, we're using the methodology of fixed reporting period. For example, we look at whether you existed last year and also this year. And if you exist in 2 consecutive years in a category of enterprises above the certain SCIO, then you will be truly counted. And then we will look at the reporting period. So we follow a very strict and rigid methodology, and we look at the different reporting period of an enterprise. And we also look at, for example, the enterprises who have been kicked out of these categories. And these enterprises, if they are not an enterprise above certain SCIO, then their profit will not be counted, but they will be counted from a different sector. And we also look at newly established enterprises, and if we have a newly established enterprise who has a profit of more than 20 million yuan, then it will be definitely counted. And the fifth category is those enterprises who disappeared or vanished or bankrupted. And we will look at, so if they vanished, then their profit is, in the first half of this year, is counted as 0. So if you look at how we manage these 5 different categories of enterprises, you will find out that this methodology is very consistent and very scientific. It has been used since 1998, and today's day it has been used for 20 years, and there is no artificial elevation of any figure or manipulation of any figure. And also, in addition to the economic factors that are affecting the profit, there are also some other elements. And number one, we have strengthened our statistical efforts from 2017 to April 2018. The National Bureau of Statistics has investigated 72 major fraud cases, and we have held a lot of government officials accountable. And the bureaus of statistics at various government levels have invested a total of 7,000 cases where people manipulate and falsify data. We also removed the repeated calculation of enterprises who are covering many different regions and different sectors. In our calculation, we found out that some of the enterprises, they are bundling the headquarter data and the data in some different regions. Let me give you one example. We have one enterprise. It has 25 subsidiaries, and 19 of them are bundled together with the headquarter, with the mother company, and they are repeating the calculation is so repeated that they registered a profit growth of 49%. So in the first half of this year, we have streamlined all those kind of situations. And also, since we have switched from the operational tax to income to added value tax, so enterprises, they are entitled to a deduction of tax, and the tax authority is giving us data indicating that over the past 2 years, the real estate industry and construction industry have witnessed a lot of newly established enterprises, and these enterprises these new established enterprises, they are also being monitored. And also, the National Bureau of Statistics will strengthen our efforts to continue to improve the quality of data. And the quality of data is the major support of our efforts in measuring economic performance, and the central government is attaching great importance to this part of the efforts, and wherever there is a mistake, it will be corrected. Wherever there is a fraud, it will be punished. We also welcome the society and also friends from the media to continue to show your support and supervision to our work so that you can help us improve the data of statistics. Next question. I'm with First Industry TV. I want to ask you, what do you think are the major factors affecting the economic growth in the second half of this year? Are there any reform measures to address the challenges in the second half of this year? This is a broad question. At present, since the beginning of this year, we have maintained a relatively stable and modest growth, and we are accumulating more positive factors than negative ones. And for the second half, we do have a lot of uncertainties and changing factors and unimbalanced factors from externally. So if you look at the first half of this year, the global economy is still recovering, but it's becoming more and more fragmented, and we have seen a rising of protectionism, and this has added to the challenges and uncertainties of our economy. But if we look at this issue domestically, we do have some unstable and uncertain elements. We are at a crucial juncture of economic restructuring. So in the future, we will continue to deepen our reform in supply side. And second, we have to maintain and strengthen our macroeconomic regulation to guarantee that the economy is kept within a reasonable range. Last question. I'm with Hong Kong TV. Will the trade war between China and the United States lead to the scenario where China's economy may slip lower than 6.7%? So you mentioned about the investments in foreign investments and exported goods. Do you expect a sluggish performance of those areas, those indicators in the second half of this year? And also for the housing price in China, despite a lot of regulatory policies, will the price of housing drop in the second half of this year? Thank you. You have actually asked a lot of questions. So the first question is about the trade war and its impact to our economy. And you also talked about its impact to price and to investments, and you also asked the question about the housing price trend. So as I have mentioned that the trade war between China and the United States, at present it's only posing a very limited impact to China, and we will have to continue to measure its impact in the future. And secondly, as for foreign investments, capital, they will go to wherever there is the profits. China is such a huge market, and it's growing so dramatically, and we are dramatically improving our business and investment environment, and we are also stepping up with better support to IPR protection. I think enterprises come into China will harvest tremendous amount of profits, and in recent months you can see a lot of international brands, they are building their presence in China. And also in the first half of this year, the FDI increased significantly in the first half of this year. So we expect that China will remain a hot destination for foreign investment. With respect to housing price, from 70 medium and large-sized cities, the overall housing price is stable. But since the beginning of this year, third-tier and fourth-tier cities have registered a significant growth of housing prices. And we still have some inventory of housing in some faraway cities. So according to the central government, we're going to have targeted control and regulations, and we will continue to improve our macroeconomic regulation and focus our attention and energy on the supply side. And we will come up with more policies and we will guarantee the supply, and we will also step up with equal rights for rent and purchase, so that we expect a establishment of a long-term mechanism, so that eventually housings are for people to live, not for people to speculate. All right, if there is no more questions, this is the end of today's release. Thank you very much.